Now I'd like to welcome to the show James Broughel, Senior Fellow and my colleague at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and also currently visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Welcome to Free the Economy, James.
Thanks for having me, Richard. Good to be here.
So normally when we think about government regulation, and I certainly think of it, we look at it sometimes as a burden on business and economic dynamism. We often think about the rules that are handed down from the big federal agencies, and here in Washington, D.C. That's the kind that our colleague Wayne Cruz writes about in his report, 10,000 Commandments. But of course, individual states also have a lot of their own rules. So looking at this, what's the argument for focusing on the state level ones when maybe some people would say the federal ones have a bigger total economic impact?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. For one, it's a lot easier to make changes at the state level. So I've been involved in a few different regulatory reform initiatives in different states over the last decade or so. And it's just it's a much smaller environment. It's easier to get access. Some cases to, a governor, you can walk into their office and start talking to them, talk to legislators. State legislators in particular are very open to new ideas, I would say. And states are, it's a cliche, but they're really the laboratories of democracy. So it's easier to get things implemented. And then if something doesn't work, there's less at stake and you can say, okay, that didn't work and move on to the next place. The other thing I would say, just partially, this is as a researcher, I say this, but there's not as much competition, I guess. So when I look at the states, I say, oh, there isn't. Well, for one thing, there's not a lot of think tank researchers or even many academics who are focused on state regulatory policy very often. So that provides me with a niche where I think I'm probably more likely to make a difference. And so that's great from a career perspective, but it also means people might be more likely to listen to what I have to say, or I can make a real contribution to research in that area. And so I guess I would just say in a lot of ways, there's a lot of opportunities at the state level.
Right. Now, so sometimes, it seems like the answer to a situation, a problem where you've got a lot of complex rules that are slowing things down and, keeping people from doing what they need to do isn't necessarily repealing all of them, because on a practical level, a lot of them were probably enacted for politically compelling reasons in the first place, and sort of getting rid of all of them probably isn't possible. So maybe the answer is making them less confusing and less expensive to comply with, which of course puts me in mind of your own recent research in places like, among other things, New York State. And looking at what you've written about New York, I thought there was a really interesting quotation here that's where you said, "Within the labyrinth of environmental regulation, good intentions often give way to bureaucratic nightmares, but amidst the tangle of red tape, there occasionally emerges a beacon of clarity, such is the case with New York State's Uniform Procedure Act, UPA, a little-known statute that offers valuable lessons for streamlining government processes." That's a very interesting quotation. Tell us about what can we learn from New York?
Sure. So I guess, I'm a fan of proceduralism, I guess you might say. It's gotten attacked, I would say, in the last couple of years more by, I don't know, different people in the intellectual community. But I tend to think, when something is going right in government or just in an organization, it's very often because they have a good system in place. And when something is not going right, it's very often because their system creates bad incentives or in some way, and it's often just the rules or the constraints in place and incentives that are leading to the good outcomes or the bad outcomes. And by tinkering with the procedures, maybe we can make things better. So I'm kind of a believer in that philosophy. Maybe that's why I'm attracted to regulation in some ways. But one of the things I liked about New York's system, and obviously New York isn't perfect in every regard, but is they have a Uniform Procedures Act for permitting processes at their Department of Environmental Conservation. So if you're at all familiar with administrative law, you might have heard of the Administrative Procedures Act, which serves kind of a similar function. So that's the federal law that basically says when we write regulations, this is the process by which we're going to follow. And that's why regulatory agencies propose rules. It's why before they finalize them, there's a comment period, there's a hearing process. and so on. And so that's really because there's this statute that governs that process. And so people are used to that in the realm of just regulations in general and how they get written and created. But what I liked about New York is they applied that kind of philosophy to their permitting rules at this one agency anyway, but it's a major agency in the state. And so they have one process for minor permits, and those move through a lot more speedily, and there's a lot less review. They have a more rigorous process for the bigger permits. They have time limits, and they're pretty much uniform. I mean, across a variety of different permits. So it isn't all the hundreds of permits that might come out of this agency. They all have a relatively the same time frame that they're required to follow, and that creates some consistency. It creates some predictability. And by tinkering with these procedures, you could probably make some big changes across a variety of different permit classes too. So I like the idea of this sort of statute, this kind of governing statute over the permitting process, because it's a good way to kind of tweak the levers and make the system go faster or slower.
So, this, makes me think of how much one state could potentially learn from another, right? And so New York has had this law for quite a while, I believe, and but we have plenty of other states who are trying to come up with new ideas today or tomorrow about how to make their own system run better, run smoother, um, and especially when it comes to permits, allow private sector people to do important new projects that they need that government permission for. So, uh, to what extent are people in other states looking around, actively looking around for better examples, or is it really up to people like you to fly into town and say, "Hey, guys, you could be doing this different. Here's what they're doing over here."
So I'll say a couple things. In the permitting space, I haven't seen as much of this kind of learning from the experience of other states, but in my general experience working with states on regulatory policy and regulatory reform, I think there's a lot of looking to other states. And legislators, um, state legislators in general, they're like you'll meet them. They're often like pretty regular people. They have sort of regular jobs. They might run a small business. They have other things going on. Usually, it's not the kind of job where you can make even often it can't even be a full-time job for some people. So they're not necessarily the kind of people who are like, reading the think tank reports, like, into the nitty-gritty of all the policy details. So they're very often looking for ideas. And so that's another good thing about the state level is like they're really open to hearing ideas from people like me. And so, there are groups like ALEC, with the American Legislative Exchange Council, that'll produce model legislation. And I think it's common for legislators at the state level to really look to organizations like that uh, for ideas. Um, and so the other thing I would say is just that um, they often kind of want to see that something's been tried before they implement it. They don't want to just try really ambitious, bold reform without seeing that it worked somewhere else. And probably some of that conservatism also exists at the federal level, which is why I think it's really important to get these state experiments happening. I guess at the state level, I would say one area where there's been some sharing of ideas is this idea of that I guess you would call these maybe process improvement systems. There are business management philosophies like lean is one of them, which is this management philosophy that came out of Toyota actually I guess in the 80s. And some of these sort of business philosophies have found their way into uh, regulatory reform and permitting reform in particular. And you'll see that the EPA at the federal level has actually been big on sharing some of these ideas with amongst the states. So you have states like Iowa that adopted this management philosophy, and they used it to basically hold events with stakeholders, identify problem areas, and really try to come up with solutions to fix very targeted, specific problems that they identified. Um, and it seemed to be pretty successful. And so after, one or two states have tried this, then the EPA had kind of collected some of these examples and shared them with other states. So that's probably a good example of the federal government playing a role as well to help share some best practices.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that I know so in addition to some states that have had good procedures for a while, like this New York one, the New York example, we have states that in the past couple of years have also launch new projects that are interesting, like the state of Virginia. I recently learned about this situation that, of course, you know quite a lot about, which is, again, like we said already, the streamlining of permits. A lot of private actors in the state need this government permission to move forward with uh, projects that will expand the economy, that will create jobs, and things like that. I think the current governor and leadership in Virginia has sort of understood that like at the very least the state government should not be standing in the way of private citizens and businesses trying to like be more productive. How much they can do to prop them up is maybe another debate. So the idea that getting your state permits faster means sort of everything works better to me is exciting. But can you give us just like a quick recap of what it is they're doing, the Youngkin and his team are doing in
Mhm.
Virginia?
Sure. So Youngkin has something called the Virginia Permit Transparency Project. It began as a pilot program, and I think this also highlights some of the benefits of pilot programs. It was an initiative at one agency, the Environmental Department in Virginia, and it was called the PEEP Project then. And they had this little like PEEP marshmallow mascot, and so they basically it was an online portal for tracking permits. And you if you submitted a permit application, then you could see at what stage in the process it was, who was responsible for the next step, either, if you were the applicant or the agency. And it had timelines associated with the different steps. You could see if something was overdue or not. And that pilot project seemed to go well, so it was expanded, and now there's, I think, something like five different departments have their permits as part of this system. Um, and there's plans to basically just incorporate as many permits as they can from statewide and maybe even local into this system. And the benefits of this are a few things. So one, just transparency, because sometimes you submit an application, you just have no idea it just goes into a black hole and you don't know what's going to happen. Second, it also works as a management tool for the regulatory agencies themselves, so they can kind of see where things are in the process and who's responsible. And it's not always the agency's fault that something takes a long time. Sometimes not all the correct paperwork was submitted and so on. And then also, just for someone like me, this can be a tool to sort of get insights into what's going on, or it gives transparency to like whether the government is on time with things, or and so it just creates a kind of an environment of accountability, and also really just brings the government into the 21st century. In some ways, you would kind of expect a lot of the stuff to just be online, be transparent. But when you compare what Virginia is doing to the federal government, I mean, there is a federal permitting dashboard that has there's certain projects that are fast tracked at the federal level. You can track some of those permits through the system, but it's not very good. It's not updated that often, and it's not very comprehensive. And so in this regard, I think Virginia is probably an example where they have a better dashboard than the federal government does, and will likely be, it already is probably more comprehensive just relative to what's going on in Virginia compared to the federal one. But um, this is I think this is a good example where the feds could probably take a lesson or two from the states.
Yeah, I like the idea that this kind of transparency is useful for a number of different reasons. So, on the one hand, like you said, it's we like to beat up on the slow-footed bureaucrats when they're being slow, but we also acknowledge obviously there's other players in the system, and it's possible that you've hired an some sort of uh, a lawyer or consultant who said that he would take care of this process for you, and maybe it turns out he's the one who's slow in filing the necessary paperwork, and which in a system where people assume it's going to be slow and there's no transparency, well, that's an easy excuse if you've got someone who maybe isn't, doing their job as fast as they should be. But also the idea that, uh, like like you said, some of these productivity enhancing processes and strategies that come from the private sector, you can have this sort of granular information about every class of permit and which one takes the longest, or which department, goes the fastest, or even which individual employee potentially is, the fastest. And if you find, you know, one part of that process is going slow, on the one hand, you could say, oh, well, that's a bad part of the process, or the people who are doing that part aren't doing their jobs. But it might just be that that part isn't organized correctly, or that there's some other gap that's like not any individual person's fault. It's just a system needs to be fixed. um and but a without this approach, right, the sort of Virginia state portal approach, you don't have enough information to know any of those things. So how could you expect it to be better?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really important things I think that they did in Virginia, and in order to just put all this stuff online, is they had to map out the process for every individual permit. And now there are some permits where maybe you just like a fishing license or something, you just submit a form and you get a permit. That kind of thing doesn't really make sense on these websites, but something that has a bunch of different steps, sequential steps, or sometimes even steps where you have to go to multiple agencies at the same time, and get a multiple approval from different authorities. That those sorts of more complex permits, they had to map out this process in order to put it online, and attach timelines to those steps. So how long should it take when you're going to this agency versus that, or at this step versus this other one? So that regulators had to really think about all that. It forced them to do that, put timelines on there. And as a result of all that, I think they had a much better sense of what the overall landscape was as far as permitting, and they could really home in on where those bottlenecks are in the process, and not just see a delay, but where specifically was that delay happening.
Yeah, and I know one of the themes we've talked about before here on the show, and is that when it comes to, who's bearing the cost of all this stuff, um, you know, processes that go too slow, people who don't get permits, uh, it's not all about big corporations having to shoulder these burdens. I think in a lot of people, the back of people's minds, they think, oh, some billionaire real estate developer hasn't gotten his permit yet. We're not going to cry for him because it's, 60 days late. Uh, some of these are sort of government permissions for very small businesses, and uh, it's sometimes small businesses and low-income households that can be hit by these regulations and the slowdowns that they create. Can you sort of talk about that, sort of like the incidence of it, of the burdens of these rules?
Sure. So one area that is definitely affected by a lot of state and local regulation in the permitting space is housing. Um, there was in fact, there was a reform that was passed in Arizona that was really targeted at land use and building more housing in particular. But um, I mean, if it's very difficult to get the proper permits to build new residences and build apartment buildings, and that's going to reduce the stock of available housing, and it's going to drive up the price of housing. And I would say this is absolutely one of the reasons why housing is so expensive in this country and in a lot of other countries as well, is that we make it very difficult to build new developments of various kinds, and it's also businesses but and industrial facilities, but it's not all the oil and gas wells or whatever that are held up in this stuff. it's regular people. There was a pretty good report that the Empire Center put out that I came across that talked about New York's Environmental Quality Act and how they had this example of a church basically that was trying to build a new church, and it got caught up in the environmental review process in New York, and there was all this local opposition. And the environmental review process just creates a veto point essentially for opposition groups of various kinds who don't want something being built in their community for a variety of different reasons, to basically home in on uh, that access point and try to block projects and tell the environmental regulator you didn't consider this kind of shadow that this structure might cast, or you didn't consider how this is going to change the character of our community. And some of these things don't even have anything to do with the environment. But these environmental review laws uh, will be weaponized really, with those based on those kinds of arguments, and they just block development. So it means fewer businesses and fewer jobs, but it also means less housing and more expensive rent.
Yeah, I think this sort of, especially when it comes to permits for housing, this comes back to the question of whether these like processes and rules that you have to go through, whether they're kind of objective things that you can easily satisfy, or whether they're really sort of subjective things that one person in the process gets to decide whether they're good enough or not. So like you said, when they went through and they created the portal process in Virginia, they sort of, one, they needed to figure out, well, what are the actual steps to get these permits in what is the process, right? And we can like lay it out all in front of us at the same point, an exercise that probably hasn't been done in a long time, if ever. And so, for me, I feel like I would ask, is it just a matter of do you fill out form 27B and as long as it's filled out, you move to the next stage? Or is it where you submit a proposal and then a few people on a board get to decide whether they like it enough or not? Because it seems I've been at zoning board meetings in Maryland where the people on the board will just say, "Oh, well, I see a drawing that your architect made, but I don't like the roof is really square. Can you make it rounded?" Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all dealt with stuff like that, from homeowners associations or whoever. And one of the things that was interesting when I was looking at Pennsylvania was there were a lot of discrepancies at their environmental department just across the different regional offices. And it seemed as though there were almost different ideologies or different, based more pro-energy, anti-energy, more environmentalist or whatever, at some of these different regional offices. And you could see that certain permits would take much longer at particular regional offices. And so what this suggests to me is there's probably too much discretion that those permit authorities, those regulators have, and that you want to be able to remove some of that discretion and make the process um, more transparent, more objective, such that if something, it's fine if you're not going to allow certain activity, fine, but make it clear. You don't want the applicant to be at the whim of the busybody kind of bureaucrat who's basically asking you to change this and that, and they have that power over you. So that's absolutely the case.
and so you talked about, New York State, another, going back to that example that they have a pretty good law when it comes to the specific thing about, permitting and things like that, and sort of the rules for how they write state rules. But if you look at comparisons of economic success in various states, at least the ones I look at, usually we have the states that are doing really well are states like Texas and Florida, and the states that are not doing particularly well are states like California, New York, and maybe Illinois. And obviously, the question of like state regulation and permitting is not the only thing that matters when you talk about success and economic dynamism in a state. So because there's a lot of others, obviously a lot of other stuff going on, how how can we measure sort of set aside the sort of legal and regulatory environment in the state, how much of an impact that's having, separate from everything else? Is it possible to really disentangle? So you sit down, you do an analysis, you're like, why is this state successful or not successful? How much of it is due to this sort of like rules and legal certainty, and how much of it is due to everything else?
Yeah. I should probably just be clear that, there's this one aspect of the permitting system in New York that I like at one of their regulators. And there's other aspects like their environmental review statute that I think are way overly burdensome and
Right. Right.
are holding back a lot of development. But as far as the broader question, I mean, this is a difficult question. I mean, I would say only in the last 10 years or so, or 15 years, have we started to get a better sense of the burden of federal regulation in the United States. There weren't really very good estimates of the total cost of federal regulation. There was a guy named Tom Hopkins who did some great work in the like 90s and even the 80s maybe, but on some of these issues, and he was doing like making a good faith effort at producing a cost estimate for the federal regs. But in the last, 10, 15 years, our colleague Wayne Cruz has been doing good work on this too, and has been part of this movement to really better estimate the total cost. Um, and, there's a big range. I would say the best estimates are that like annually the federal regulatory burden is somewhere in the order of like 1.5 to the high end is like $30 trillion, which would suggest, our GDP would be two or three times higher if we didn't have all these regulations on the books. But so there's a huge range out there. Probably the range might be, 2 to 4 trillion might be the sort of central best estimate out there, but there's a lot of uncertainty in this. Um, but there's at the state level, there aren't really good estimates like that yet. And while we're starting to get a sense of like who has more regulation, and it's sometimes it's I would say very often it's the bigger economy states or regions that have more regulation. And so there's this kind of like endogeneity issue, which is like because some people you could say, well, New York has all this regulation, which it does, and it's also a really rich place, so the regulation must be causing all this prosperity, right? Or, we think probably you and I don't think that's probably the case, but there could be other stories there, which is it could be just that they have the luxury of having these really rich, wealthy industries like finance or in California, Silicon Valley, and they can basically just tap that resource almost endlessly and do all kinds of silly things in their jurisdiction. And, it allows them to some freedom to pursue bad policies that maybe the smaller states don't have. But who knows? It could be a combination of these stories. I would say that the research is still trying to tease out exactly what all the biggest contributors to the amount of regulation are and to economic growth as well. Um, and it may be cultural factors. It may be, there is some like red state versus blue state differences in the regulation amount of regulation. And there's some differences in population size. Bigger, more populous population is actually one of the best predictors of how much regulation a jurisdiction has. You have more people, you're going to have more regulation. Maybe more people means less trust or more, I don't know, externalities or whatever it might be. But for whatever reason, that seems to be a predictor. Um, and then when you just putting regulation aside, what are all the other contributors to economic growth? So regulation's one variable, but kind of like an entrepreneurial culture or, just the rate of innovation, the rate of scientific discovery. These are obviously really important factors. Regulation is going to factor into some of those things. But regulation itself is a result of some of these cultural forces as well. So it's like how much of slow growth do you blame on regulation versus other factors? It's difficult to tease all these things out. And economists are trying the best they can, but we're still learning.
Yeah, I think I should give a shout out to some of your former colleagues at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I know in I think it was episode 32 we had Patrick McLaughlin on, and he was talking about uh, again sort of state regulations, uncertainty, and how we're uh, as the private sector even know what the rules are. Sometimes even that is a problem. But I've definitely also heard about this sort of back and forth about, well, if you've got big states that that have a lot of economic activity going on, and they also have a lot of regulation, people would say, oh, well, that means that the regulation's not really slowing them down. Uh, but you also, capital formation is also an important part of economic growth. And so if New York City and Silicon Valley have more of that, then like you said, it sort of helps them stand up to uh, or the policies that probably aren't helping them, but the effect is relatively smaller because they have a sort of like big kind of powerhouse going with those big industries already.
I
Um,
mean, I would say the business community is very often an ally on regulatory reform, but not always. And some often like, sunset provisions are a good example. So it's a bit sunset provision is the idea that you attach an expiration date to a regulation. Maybe it expires after 7 years, and has to be renewed after that point and reauthorized and justified that this thing is still needed. And I've definitely seen businesses oppose sunset provisions, and they're pretty straightforward about the reasons why. And they'll say, we fought hard to get a lot of these regulations in place and or get them the way we wanted them, and we don't want to jeopardize and see them go away. And so essentially they kind of want it both ways. They want to get rid of the regulations that they personally find burdensome, but when regulations benefit them and maybe burden someone else, they don't want to get rid of them. And I think that kind of two-faced, you know, uh, duplicitousness is like not productive. And, if you really want to make the kind of bold changes that I'd like to see happen, you need people to kind of recognize that it's not every policy is going to maybe personally benefit me, but um, as the reform as a whole will benefit the community or the nation. And so we're going to do this for the sake of everybody instead of just taking our own snapshot of our own narrow interests. So, um,
well, actually, just
but yeah,
everyone tear the Band-Aid off at the same time, and then we'll.
yeah. But and by the way, I mean, you mentioned earlier, it's difficult to do bold reforms, but there was an effort in Idaho in 2019, and they sunset their entire administrative code that year, and they basically rewrote the code from scratch, um, and eliminated, depending on the measure, something like 40 to 25% of their regs. So, I mean, you can do some big things. Um, but it takes some strong leadership, and it takes I guess some strong political momentum or credibility in order to pull it off.
Well, yeah, I mean, we so on the show we just talked to Gonzalo Schwartz from the Archbridge Institute in our last episode, and so he and his colleagues have the study of economic mobility in the 50 states, which I think produced some like really interesting rankings. It's not always the sort of expected usual suspects um, ranking high and low. So like in their case, that when it comes to again to economic mobility, they put Utah, Minnesota, and Montana at the top, and then Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi at the bottom. Um, so we've mentioned several states going, during this conversation, but when it comes to the kind of system change reform you would most like to see, do you have as for right now, your top states, who are the best performers and who are the ones that need the most work?
I'm Yeah, I mean, I'm currently working on a report about North Dakota that I would definitely say uh, they're a pretty good example of a good state that seems to make it pretty easy. I think their permit fees we were just looking at like to get a permitted for an oil well, and it was like $100 in North Dakota, and it has been for years. And you look at like a state like Pennsylvania, I think it's like 12,000. And they've just ratcheted up those fees like a bunch of times in the last few years. There's also so I think about two-thirds of states have some kind of environmental review statute like NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. So that's basically what that says is before the government makes a decision, takes a major action, it has to study the environmental effects of that action. And so that was passed in 1969 or 70. And basically, a bunch of states, most of the states, adopted some version of that statute. And it ranges in its stringency across the states, but some states don't have one at all. And I think that that really highlights how, and some states have gotten rid of them, like New Mexico got rid of it. They just said this is too burdensome, it's going to cost too much, and we don't want to deal with this. Um, and so I think that just highlights like, do we really need this NEPA statute? If the states don't seem to, there are plenty of states that seem to get by just fine without this. And this is one of the statutes, at least at the federal level, it's often pointed to as really the most problematic, is causing delays and getting all sorts of projects hung up in it, like the congestion pricing in New York City got hung up
Mhm.
in NEPA review. And you're like, how are these things even related? But it had, probably needed some kind of air permit or something like that, which is a federal jurisdiction. And, there you go. Then you get years and years of environmental review and studies and, 1,000-page reports and environmental groups litigating on that. Um, and so I think that there's some examples at the state level there. One thing I'll say is that I'd like to see, which I haven't really come across, and I've been a little surprised or disappointed, but I'm still conducting my research. It's just more reforms focused on limiting litigation. Just because this is one of the big areas where projects get hung up, or just fear of a permit being challenged by some environmental group or other group. Yeah, not in my backyard kind of group. Just to say, like, um, you know, we should my own view is there should probably be limits on like who has standing to challenge certain permitting decisions, or if you're doing an environmental review and the agency's doing an environmental analysis, there should be a clear sense of like what is sufficient to say that you've studied enough. You don't need to study those shadows. You don't need to
Mhm.
uh, look at those community character impacts or whatever it is. That the agency has done a sufficient job at this point. So you don't create this opportunity for different interest groups to say you didn't study this, you didn't study that, and just an endless list of things. And that's really where NEPA went off the rails at the federal level. NEPA is a pretty short statute relative to a lot of other laws out there. It's like, I think the original version was like 5 pages, but it's just the courts have interpreted it in such a way that it's become this monstrosity. Um, so I would say, yeah, the state should be more, if you really want to make major changes to the permitting problems, you need to tackle that litigation issue.
All right. Well, it sounds like there's lots of room for improvement. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for being with us, James. And before we go, where should people follow you and find your work?
So you can follow me on Twitter at James Broughel, Broughel. You can go to ci.org, find my research papers. I have it's a series called Fast Track, which is where my state permitting reports. That's the name of the publication series, so you can check that out.
All right. Thanks again, James.
Thanks.